But next up, I want to introduce a good friend from up north, well, northeast at least. Our first speaker this afternoon is a seasoned artist, creative director, and entrepreneur with over 25 years of experience in concept art, art direction, and business leadership as well. As founder of Atom Hawk, he built the award-winning concept art studio, design studio, into an internationally recognized brand, working with studios such as Marvel Pictures, Warner Brothers, Microsoft, Sony on big blockbuster movies such as Guardians of the Galaxy. Excuse me, over 30 video games, including The Thing and The Thing Remastered. Big time difference. Mortal Kombat X. He's literally written the book on the art direction. We've got it in the MMU library if you want to check that out. He joins us here today to share lessons from his career, giving it a view into high-level concepts behind art directing and the role of the art director in developing and communicating a style. Please give a warm welcome to Cumron Ashtiani.
Hello, folks. Hello. Hey. It's great to be here. Thanks for inviting me. So, Cumron Ashtiani, what a name, eh? You don't hear that often. And the reason why I have that name is because I was destined for a different world than the one I actually live in today. So, I actually started out my life in Iran, and I lived in Tehran for a good number of my early years. This dude here, on the bass guitar in the middle, is my dad. And you look at him, you think he doesn't look very Iranian. He's very Western looking, and that's because back then, Iran was a very different place. So, pre-revolution, very sort of westernized, very easygoing, and we lived here. My mum's English, so my mum and dad met at university in Lancaster and ended up moving out to Iran. Unfortunately, when I was about 3 years old, this happened, and we had to leg it very quickly. And all the kind of liberal thinking kind of people in Iran pretty much found themselves having to exile. And we all came to places like the UK, America, Europe. And that led to me growing up in the UK, which was a good thing, because I think if I hadn't grown up here, I would have never been exposed to cool things like Star Wars, Indiana Jones, all the other crazy things that influenced my career and made me who I am today. But in every typical way that English kids do, they shorten people's names, and I ended up becoming Ron. So that's what everyone calls me. Okay, so I started out my career in 1998. I was an artist, working in video games. Back then, there weren't defined roles. I was also doing animation, I was doing UI, I was doing pretty much everything I was like a one-man art team. And I worked on all these games, some of which you probably never heard of. Has anyone heard of any of these games? Hey, look at that, that's a result. Okay, so not as bad as I thought. Probably the biggest one of all of those was The Thing, top right, which was I think it sold over 1 million units, which back then was a ton. But now, compared to modern games, not so much. After about 12 years of working in dev, I found myself as head of art at Midway Games in Newcastle. Does anyone remember Midway Games? Smaller number. Okay, so Midway back then had 1,000 employees. It was the 4th biggest video game publisher in the world. They did like Mortal Kombat. They did all sorts of, sort of games all the way from like the 1950s, where they did pinball machines, all the way up to the 2009 when they closed. So I found myself here as head of art, and the financial crisis hit, and we were closed, and not just closed a bit, closed forever. Like the company went completely bankrupt. Stuffed us for 12 weeks' pay as well, which was disgraceful. And I did what all artists do in a crisis. I took my team to the pub, and fueled on many, many pints, we decided, screw this, let's leave game development altogether, because at the time it was the Wild West. Let's set up an art company and just do the art for games and do it really bloody well. So that was the dream. We were, fueled on a lot of alcohol, and day one in the studio looked like this. Didn't quite live up to what we'd told ourselves, but look how happy we are. We're blown away. You know what I mean? It's like that radiator, by the way, in the far wall, couldn't turn it off. It's the middle of August. boiling in there. Those bars on the windows, couldn't open them. So Colin, the guy furthest away, he's South African, so he didn't care. For him, it was normal temperature. And I took one for the team and also sat by the radiator. But it was all right. It was good. It was good times. And that company became Atom Hawk. So I think we thought we were going to have to start all the way at the bottom and work our way to the top again. But actually, within a couple of days, the phone started ringing, and we became very busy very quickly. So, in the first year of business, we pretty much worked on all of these different games, providing mostly concept work, design work, UI work. And I think maybe 2 years in, 2011, I got a random email from someone from an AOL account saying, "Hey Ron, my name's Charles Wood. I'm a production designer working for Marvel, and I'd like you guys to come and work on some new films with me in Shepperton." Now, I thought this is definitely a blag. Someone's like, having me on. But I was going to London anyway for a meeting, so I thought, I'll go to Shepperton, I'll meet them. And when I got there, it was all derelict Shepperton at the time. They'd stopped filming there, and Marvel had taken a lease, but not really, it hadn't been public knowledge yet. So I thought, this is so dodgy, like, broken furniture everywhere, litter where people have broken in. And he's just sort of telling me, yeah, we're going to be filming these films here. And I'm thinking, this could be nuts. But I said at the end of the meeting, bizarrely, could you just get someone from Marvel to send me an email, give me a call to confirm this is real? And he just laughed and went, yeah, of course I can, that's fine. And then the next day I got a call from a guy called Nigel Costello, who at the end of all the Marvel movies, you'll see executive producer Nigel Costello. He called me and said, "Hey Ron, I think Charles said you don't think this is real? Like it's real." And I was like, oh my God. So anyway, the studio grew massively in that time. We suddenly went from being a handful of people to, I think we were about 25 people when we were working on the Marvel stuff, which was a big growth pattern considering we were only 2 or 3 years old. And by the end of my 10 years at the company, we'd worked on over 30 different products, and these are just some of the sort of highlights of that. We worked on all the Mortal Kombat games from Mortal Kombat 9 all the way up to Mortal Kombat 1, the most recent one. And that success was noted. So I just got to year sort of 8, and then people started offering to buy the company, integrate us in, and Sumo made me an offer I couldn't refuse. And I even got to go, and we did a stock market flotation. Top left, I got to go and ring the bell at the London Stock Exchange. And I was just standing there thinking, how on earth did I, as an artist, end up here at the London Stock Exchange doing a stock market flotation? It was the most surreal thing, but very cool. What did I do after that? Well, I stayed for a couple of years as a managing director. It wasn't really my thing. I've always been a creative guy. I didn't really gravitate towards that role. So I moved on, and I became the old wizard for many people. And I advised these different companies and how to grow their business and what to do with it. Sock Monkey, for example, is now Behaviour UK North, based up in Middlesbrough. And that was a great time. I also wrote a book during COVID, which some of you may have read or may have not have read, but it's in the library here apparently. So, and that was my COVID Stop Me From Going Mad project. I'd never written a book before as well, so it was quite a learning curve. And I also most recently worked on this game, which was the first game I'd worked on in 5 years. And I loved it. It was awesome. It really was. It was great also going back to a game that I'd made when I was 25 and reimagining it now 20 years later. And that was fantastic. And the team at Night Dive as well were brilliant. They were so respectful. Like it was almost bizarre. I was kind of like, guys, if you think you need to change it and make it cooler, make it cooler. And they're like, no, but we don't want to, like, almost like preservation. When you think about people preserving an old oil painting or a statue, they really didn't want to mess with anything unless I was cool with it. But it was totally fine, and I think it came out pretty well. I also paint a lot. So I'm an oil painter now, and I've painted probably about 50 paintings in the last year. I'm just prolific. It's what I do in my spare time, among other things. So what about art? So that's what I'm here to talk to you about. Okay, so as you all know, art and creative content is worth absolutely billions these days. These franchises, you see Disney buying, things, particularly Lucasfilm. I mean, God knows how much they paid for that, but it was some serious money. 4 billion. That's an epic amount of cash. So it's big money. And that is surprising because all throughout history, up until the last pretty much 50 years, art has been really hard to make happen. Like artists have always been sponsored by patrons. They've been supported by usually the crown or the church, but there's been no other way to make money really as an artist, and it's been a pretty miserable existence. Until really, these guys came along, and not so much Van Gogh, because he didn't make any money in his actual lifetime, but there were some pretty famous artists of the last century who actually managed to make some money, apart from maybe Turner in the century before. But something you'll see in common about all of these people, they're weird. They're all weirdos. And the problem with being a weirdo is that doesn't work very well in a team. So they're all pretty much like Batman. They work alone, they're grouchy, they talk in a voice like that, and they're like, they don't want to be messed with. And what you need in a studio, making modern video games and films, is people more like the Avengers, where they're all happy working together, apart from maybe Thor and Hulk, but they're good otherwise. And that kind of explains what I do, because working with creative people is often likened to working with cats, slightly offensively, but that kind of makes me the crazy cat lady. So art, right? So art is a form of communication. No matter what you're doing with it, that's what its purpose is. And when you start a project, you need to think about what are the goals that the art's trying to achieve, who's it trying to influence, how are we going to make it, and what's the quality bar expected. And this goes for whether or not you're making fine art or a film. It's all the same process. Are you trying to convey story? Are you trying to illustrate, game in a frame, or as they say, like a book illustration, where you try and tell the story in one picture and it's got multiple things going on. It's a brand sort of image. Are you trying to convey an experience? So in games, we do a lot of these kind of like sell sheets where we're talking about, this is what the gameplay is going to feel like, and it's trying to get an emotion across about the experience the game is going to have. Are we talking about conceptual ideas? So conceptual ideas in games, some of the concept art, well, not some of it, 90% of it is never seen by the public, because it's just little things like this, explaining, trying to get like a technical person and a design person and an art person and a narrative person around a table, around an idea, and to work together. Because while they discuss it with words, it's very easy to misinterpret what someone else is saying. Design consistency across multiple media. So this is a really good example. Like, sometimes you're designing something that isn't just going to live in the product that you make, but it's going to live on through a bunch of other products. So, like this particular design ended up as a Lego kit, and Guardians of the Galaxy, the Milano, which we designed, also ended up as a massive Lego kit. It was about 300 quid, I think. It was crazy. And it's funny as well, the creative process, right? So people talk about the creative process, and on LinkedIn, you see stuff like this. This is how the creative process works. It's very mechanical and clean and very Apple. But the reality is it works like this. That one on the left, this is awesome, this is tricky, oh no, this is shit, oh no, I'm shit, and then might be okay. And then you slowly turn it around, and all artists go through this. I was working on a painting only on Monday. I started feeling great about it, and then by the middle of the day, I was like, I'm just going to chuck this away. But I know better than that. I know as a professional, you've got to push through that low point, and you'll usually come out the other side. Design through iteration. I mean, this is like, as an art director, this is a really standardized process. You just work your way from beginning to end through various iterations, finding things that work well, and eventually you end up with the final design. And this is what you're probably learning here in education. It's a pretty standard process. However, I also really like this process. So this is when you chuck a load of ideas at the top, possibly done by different people. And as an art director, this is one that if the budget's there for multiple people, I'll use it. I have 3 or 4 people working on something, and then we iterate down through that process. So if you look at this convergence funnel, this is a real example. You've got like 5 different artists working on the first stage at the top, and then we reduce it to 4, to 2, and then 1 basically hit the money, and that became the final design. And then as an art director overseeing a game, you're also doing that on multiple streams. So you're doing the characters, the environment, the effects, how things fit together in the game world. And it's just all these different streams, and usually you have a lead in charge of each of those, but you're overseeing the overall vision. And someone has to oversee the overall vision, because otherwise you get this crazy stuff going on where everyone's pulling in a different direction. These individual people are all brilliant, but they're all being brilliant in their own way and not in the same, not singing from the same hymn sheet. So having an art director there aligns everybody and makes sure that the overall vision is adhered to, and also makes sure that the executives upstairs who are making the money decisions are happy with the process. And there's quite a bit of sort of like diplomatic, politics going on, which the artists are protected from because they don't see that, because they're just working away. But the art director is usually having to go and sit in meetings and make sure everyone's on board. Okay, so the basics. I talk about this a lot: style, theme, genre. People get it wrong all the time. It's something that's like a sort of a mainstay. So let's see if I don't get it wrong. Genre. Oh, hang on a minute. I am going to get it wrong. No, it's all right. So yes. In Banksy's work, genre is is street art. That's what he's working in. And theme is those kind of dystopian, slightly sarcastic kind of critiques he makes on usually capitalist life. And style is the black and white stencil kind of look to it. And as long as you can kind of keep those straight in your head, you can always talk in a way that people are on the same page with. Understanding themes, I like to do sort of like is not kind of sheets, just to be sure that everyone, because everybody's language is different. And so if you caveat not only what something is, but also what it isn't, you double up on your kind of communication. And then why stylize at all? So I don't know. Do you know what? In the noughties, there was a massive push in games to make everything seem real, because we couldn't make it seem real. And so it seemed aspirational. And then just as we got to sort of the beginning of the teens, we started to be able to produce things that look real, and we didn't like it. It was like, actually, like, it doesn't, why make real life? And I think the truth of it is, the reason why we stylize is to make a product stand out. We do it for gameplay reasons. We do some pretty outlandish things in video games that if the style is real, suddenly it breaks the disbelief. We do it for escapism. People live in cities. They don't always want to play games in cities. Screen size and power. Obviously, if you're working on a mobile phone, you're not going to do something incredibly detailed and real because you're not going to be able to see it on the screen. And making abstract concepts more believable. I mean, that ties into the gameplay thing. But I worked on a game featuring Vin Diesel. If anyone remembers him, nobody remembers him now. But at the time we did this game, he was like the man, right? And this game featured him jumping 50 feet or meters, 30 meters between each car. And it was a realistically styled game, and it looked ridiculous. It was just like, so we ended up having to make the game a bit more cartoony. When he jumps, we added some effects to make it look like more sort of superhero comic speed lines. And suddenly it was like, oh yeah, I can believe that now, strangely. It just takes you one step away from the reality of it and allows your mind to sort of, accept it. Stylization from a game design point of view, this top image is like a classic mainstay of art direction. Team Fortress 2, how each character has its own unique silhouette. And that's important for gameplay because you need to be able to know what character class they are when you're playing. Because it's a first-person shooter, you need to be able to recognize them instantly. And then just talking a bit about realism again, we still can't even do it in films. When you think about it, like most of the time, it's pretty rough. And I think that it's not... Do you remember... the Princess Leia moment, that was pretty... She was fine until she spoke, and then when she spoke, it all went to bits. But in general, we haven't really mastered it, and I don't know why we keep chasing it, to be honest. I really like hyperrealism, where you take what is real about something and exaggerate it, and it actually looks realer than real, but it allows you to get away with a little bit more from a suspension of disbelief point of view with the player. And then combining stylization and realism. I mean, you can combine whatever you like, and this is something that I think when you become, professional artists, or you already are professional artists, you start playing with this. But as an art director, it is pretty much what you do for a living, is just trying to work out what level of stylization will go with what level of realism, what the balance of detail should be. And some of these are fantastic. I mean, look at, this Guile character from Street Fighter 2, realistically rendered, but yeah, stylistically proportioned. It works so well. And then the goals. So, got to think about who the target audience is. And this is probably a mistake I made a lot in my early career, trying to make games that were for me, because it was what I was into. And I think it's one of the hardest things, I think, as an artist working as a professional, is when you're a student, you kind of given projects to work on, but you can always tailor them to what you're into. They're always quite sort of vague in the exact details, and you can do that. When you get into the professional world, sometimes you have to work on things that are just absolutely not what you're into. And rather than kind of bitch and moan about it, you just, it's your job. You're getting paid for it, and you have to just do it. Now, ultimately, if you can find another job around the corner that is doing something that's exactly what you want to do, then do it. But ultimately, you do find yourself, I've had a lot of young artists be like, oh, I'm selling out on my creative principles. You're like, come on, and you're getting paid for it. It beats working in a bank or in a supermarket or whatever. We're getting to make art for a living, which is fantastic. So is it these guys? If it is, it's probably going to be cartoony. Is it the pro gamers? It's probably going to be very detailed. Is it for these guys? There's quite a lot of old people gaming now, me included. Can't see the screen properly without my glasses on. Or is it these guys? The worst. Hardcore fans, Harry Potter fans. I say this because I worked on Harry Potter for 6 years, and they are, fussy, to be polite. And then thinking about the product position. So at the very beginning of a development, you really need to think about where your game fits in with other games and where it fits in the market. And, I think it's very important to get this right, because what you tend to find is if you don't pitch it to the other people in the team, they'll all have their own little idea of where the game fits, and it will be roughly in the same area, but it won't be exactly. And then you'll eventually get 6 months down the line where you've made a whole bunch of art, and people will be like, oh, this isn't really what I expected it to be. So it's totally worth putting the work in at the beginning to make sure you pin it down and communicate that to everyone. And then also, what's the artistic target? How, rendered stylization, proportional stylization, detail. You can do these all day long, these graphs with different products in them to work out where you're headed. Again, I showed you a verbal is not reference sheet. Once we get to actually making some art, we can start doing visual is not reference sheets. And this one I pick out because it features the worst thing I've ever seen in my life. George Clooney, Batman. What on earth is going on? Why is he dressed like that? It makes no sense. And the thing with Batman is, and you see this with a lot of sequels, is they just keep adding bells and whistles every time another version comes out until you end up with madness. And then someone goes, oh no, we're going to have to reboot this now because we've gone too far. And it goes all the way back to just wearing a black jumper. Do you know what I mean? And it's you see it time and time again. We're already there again with the most recent Batman. He's gone back to wearing Doc Marten boots and a black jumper. It's just cyclical. So what I was trying to communicate to the team is these designs on the right are classic designs, and it doesn't matter what era they're from. They work because they're just nice. From a design point of view, you've got to look at it that way. Whereas the ones on the left are sticking spoilers on cars. It's kind of a weird thing. So exploring and communicating the style. So a lot of stylistic wayfinding is done by looking at history and looking at things that have a very distinct look and then blending them with other things. So you take steampunk and Victorians and you end up with the game from 10 years ago, The Order. That's a simple one. You look at the telling of a story where one will come and save us all. An oppressive regime, and the space race. Can anyone guess what it is? And the influences of this from those reference points is so clear, but it creates something completely new that at the time nobody really noticed it, but now obviously we see it a mile off because loads of people have copied it. The importance of reference from a visual point of view. So, I tend to start quite broad, where I look at just like colors, tonal values, trying to find things that have the right kind of vibe for what I'm going to do, and then I'll move into more detailed things like exact sort of details, exact rendering, and what are we going to look at. And sometimes it'll be like, I like the colors from Miyazaki, but I like the stylistic proportions from Warner Brothers. It's kind of, you've got to find the right mix. And you can blend this reference, and I'll show you how that was done. So, for example, human anatomy, sort of, I would say, messy machinery, and Gothic architecture. That's really the work of H.R. Geiger. That's what he did. He blended these things together and created his own style. Also with a bit of a weird sexual thing going on as well, which I'll not cover here. But yeah, great artist. And depending on the amount you blend these things gives you a different result. So for Gears of War, John Wallen-Liberto, he took a little bit of that biological influence, quite a bit of the messy machinery, but a lot of it, more of it, of the Gothic architecture, and ended up with these lovely Gothic sort of alien buildings for Gears of War. I love that. When I saw that, it made me sick. It made me so jealous. It's like, you bastard. But it was great. And then I had a little go at some of these myself, just as a sort of practice exercise. So this was taking 1920s trains at the end of the steam era, beginning of the diesel era, and mixing them with 1950s aircraft to create weird sort of space dropships and things like that, with a very kind of diesel punk kind of theme to them. This is like a day's worth of work just cobbled together. I was also doing things like this, where it was like taking the bird, the sort of anatomy of a bird, but also how birds are represented in metal forms. So if you think about in America, that's the Chrysler building. They had the eagles, but represented in metal. How would you apply that to a spacecraft again? And then this one, looking at 1950s cars really, and how you could sort of create like in Star Wars Phantom Menace, where the Princess Amidala has that fantastic ship, but it's obviously referencing 1950s cars. It's a similar kind of vibe to that. Looking at trains and a snake and a hot rod drag car, and how that would come together into a spacecraft. And usually you find the more sort of separated your reference points are, the more interesting the output is, because you get very interesting, like the snake. When I thought, shall I stick a snake in there? I thought, no, this is going to be crazy. But actually, the mouth of the snake creates this shape at the front, and the bulge in the middle where the cobra has its gills creates the bulge in the middle. Works all right, I thought. I was quite happy with that. I do tons of rangefinders, like just reference, put on sheets, and trying to work out how they fit in relation to each other, and then how what I'm going to do is going to fit in relation to these other things that are already out there. And then when I get to the actual level of stylization, you've got some concept artists usually by that point, or I'm doing the concept, and I'll do the same things in slightly different style. So taking the form, and abstracting it and abstracting it and abstracting it till we get to a point where it's just a series of shapes. And that gives you a sort of, it gives you the knowledge to then say, okay, where is the important point on this range of style that the viewer, I think, will engage with the best in the simplest terms. And also there's cost. So if you're looking at it and saying, I've got 100 grand to make a cartoon, you're going to go far right, because that's going to be the easiest thing to draw over and over again in different positions. But if you've got a ton of money, you can go with a lot more detail. Looking at, detail again, the level of detail within the render. Proportions within a realistic style. Again, this was for a game, never came out, but we started with the realistic version. Didn't read very well on screen. Like when he's walking around, he didn't have the presence. So we started to bulk him up and bulk him up and bulk him up until actually when he was moving, that animation read better because his body was more sort of exaggerated. And then just looking a little bit at direction for games and film, because I've done both. A lot more games than I have film, but I had about 4 years working with Marvel. So in games, we have to cater to different hardware. And that does dictate the look of something. And usually as well, handheld, you want it to be easily readable, the screen's lower resolution, or that is changing. And so you don't want to be going super detailed like you will with a PC game. Likewise in games, we tend to see objects in a 3D world and we can move freely around them. That means we have to design all of it. It's very rare in a game where you just get away with designing something from one angle. And that means that we end up having to do orthos, front and back views. We have to properly think about how it's going to maybe, this ship, if it's going to land in the game, how does the landing gear come out? We have to think about all of these things. In films, quite often that's not even thought about. It's only going to appear in one shot. We have to think about game design. So, in this particular example on the right, we had a city. So this was before the days where games could be instantly loaded all at once. So unlike PlayStation 2 and PlayStation 3, if you had a city, you had to basically load parts of it as you went through it. And so we bridged it with these long bridges, which meant that we could do a load in that space. And it was a technical limitation. So we had to design a world that had these gated, long sort of drives between points in the world where we could do a massive load. But it's just the way it works. And games still have these limitations today, it's just they're different. This was an example of also the same game, how the idea was that the upper tiers of the world were where the wealthy people were living, and they didn't have to get into the dirt below. And the sort of red area below in the far left image is basically where the gameplay happens. So you see this world above, and it's hinted to for the narrative, but you never actually go there because that would be crazy to have to build a world that large. And then once we've kind of done some design work, I think the game designers, they have to, design is king, right? Game design is king. The game has to play right above all other things, and art is really just a wrapper for a great game design. And a game design is really just a series of systems interacting with each other in a way that's pleasing and tactile. So what I like to do is let the game designers kind of do what they need to do from a level design point of view. So this image on the left, they needed a shootout to happen in this game, and they needed objects for cover. And usually in games, it's crates in a warehouse, particularly 10, 15 years ago, and that's just the mainstay of it. Well, in this case, we're like, what if it's in a church? What if the cover points are the pews? And they can actually be moved around a bit with a bit of physics as well, so you could kind of push the pew along a little bit and use it as a cover point. So we let design play with a bunch of grey box props, and then once they'd sort of finished and we're happy with the layout, we then took the screenshot from Unreal and painted over the top of it to show the environment team what it's going to look like. In games, we also have to guide the viewer. So if you think about it, you're in a first-person game or a third-person game, and you're able to look everywhere, right? How do you make the player look at that thing over there that's the most important thing they need to look at? And there's a whole bunch of ways of doing it. Sometimes it's a sound cue. Sometimes it's an effect, like flashing. What I also really like is having a moving object guide the player's eye to it. So, for example, you'll have like we worked on Killzone Mercenary, and we had a crashed spaceship fly down on fire, flies past you, so you can't miss it because it's on fire, and it crashes right where you're supposed to go. You kind of know straight away. It's about as obvious as you can get. But one of the simple ways is just to guide the player through the world to the beautiful thing they're supposed to experience. So we'd go through a canyon, it's hemmed in, and then eventually we pop out the other end. We see the beautiful vista at the other side. In film, things are very different. So in film, firstly, a lot of the time, we want to be using real-world locations, because building a set for a massive farmhouse like that with all the land around it would be ridiculous. Like, and think about how many shots you have in a film. So if we can just find a farm that looks like the farm we want to film in, we'll just do that because that's the best way to do it. But then there's suddenly some little green screen things that have to happen afterwards and affect stuff. So this is actually Hawkeye's home in Avengers Age of Ultron. And that barn, the script says he has a barn which basically has things in it that's key to the story, but we couldn't find a farm with that barn. So the way it's done in the film is the barn is actually added in VFX afterwards, but the farmhouse is real because that's where we needed the actors to be able to walk around with each other. So as an art director with this, you're sort of like looking at photos of locations saying, this could fit the bill, and we can add this here, that's okay. So you're looking for the space within the place to be able to add the barn in. A lot of film concept is designed to camera. In a game, like I was saying, you're in a full 3D world, you can walk all the way around it. In film, you just see a glimpse of it. If you think about the cantina in Star Wars, you see some weird bubble-headed dudes playing on that weird instruments they've got. You see a guy at the bar, you don't see any of the rest of that room. You don't need to know. And it was the same with Guardians of the Galaxy. When they go into the boot of Exeter, it's called this bar, that you really just see an establishing shot and the rest of it's just conversational. We also do, in film, a lot of these kind of moody smoke and mirrors shots. So these are not even designed, the film won't actually even look like this because the people who are building the set will figure that out. They just want to know what the colors are going to be, what the lighting should be, what's going to be in shadow, what's going to be in light, and then they'll riff from this. So we would generate, I don't know, maybe 10 of these or something, and they would take from them and do what they like with it afterwards. The other thing in film is iteration, tons of it. So this is the Milano spacecraft from Guardians of the Galaxy, their Millennium Falcon, and we did 162 of these. And Roberto Castro, who was the artist who did them all, it nearly broke him, to be honest. He was just doing this for 8 months. And then, bizarrely, at the end of it all, they picked one that was probably about number 10. So it was kind of like, but the whole thing is you're having to do all these variations to just prove that the one that is right, because you've explored all other options. And that was the final one that James Gunn picked out. And then after you've done the cool concept shot, because it's going to be built not only by the 3D people to make it work in the VFX scenes, but also quite a lot of this ship was a physical set. We have to build it as like a schematic. So we would do it to that level in concept. Then it's handed over to a draftsman team, who would actually then draw it almost like an architectural design and annotate what would be made of MDF, what would be made of aluminium, what would be plaster. And I actually saw this ship, they built the main sort of hold bit with the cockpit as a physical set, and I got to go and see it. And it was amazing. They've got, their seats were trimmed. I think they were trimmed by a guy who trims seats for Bentley. And that's the detail they went to. It was like, everything was like, is that real leather? Oh my God, it's real leather. Like, this must have cost an absolute fortune. But it showed, and they used it for 2-3 films afterwards. So they got good value out of it in the end, I think. This was one of the pods that I saw. This was at Comic-Con. This was actually used in the film. And you can see the detail that it's built to. And this isn't even a major part of the film. This is just like a background thing. But they shipped it there. It's only when you get really close to it, you realize it's made of MDF, and it's all screwed together and then sprayed, and then they use various molds to sort of, and they use a lot of 3D printing as well. I'm an alligator. This is some of the shots we designed in the final film. we worked on a lot of shots for that movie. And that's me done. Thank you. Yeah, out of time for questions? Or?
Anytime, yeah. So I love the way Ron says he knocked up one of those images in like a day, which would take us probably weeks and weeks on end. That's awesome. Has anyone got any questions?
Hi, I'm Andy. I work for MBD. We do VR, lots of heritage stuff. I'm really curious about how you talked a lot about iteration kind of between multiple companies, say, or kind of how art direction may have affected the script, which in turn is then coming back to you, and how you handle that kind of outside of your team, how you handle iteration on a wider scale.
Yeah, well, iteration happens at every level. So there's the artists themselves working away and going, maybe don't like that I've just done, I'll just change it. And then there's the art director working with them and saying, actually, maybe we should just change this. Or, you know, usually you have a chat, you riff some ideas together, and suddenly it's like, oh yeah, the landing gear should come out like this. And, you know, then suddenly they're like, oh, I'll just redraw this because that's a cool idea. Then there's, you know, revision with the other people in your department, in your company, other companies, you know. So it goes on and on forever. And eventually, what you tend to find is some decisions get made just purely through time pressure. So you end up getting to a point where they've got to start filming this in 2 weeks' time. So somebody's got to make a choice, and that usually pushes it through. And I actually prefer that. I don't like something like the Milano, for example. I think because it was such a key part of the film, it got a lot of scrutiny and a lot of if you think about designing iconic spacecraft, like it's like picking the right actor for a role. You know, it's a really important thing, and I think that was a unique sort of thing to get that much scrutiny and that much iteration.
Hi, I'm Penny. I'm a first-year game art student here. Would you say that you would have like more scruffy kind of sketches than like compared to like the final pieces? Like, what's the ratio of like rough ideas to like fully like more fleshed concept art?
A lot. So I'm showing you here the final concept and the shot for the movie really to show how close they are together. What I could show you is like the 50 terrible sketches that went before that, and very kind of like loose drawings, but we don't have time for that here. But it is definitely, a lot of the stuff you produce when making a game or making a film, it goes straight in a folder somewhere, never to be seen again once it's been communicated. It's not final. I do think though that it depends what kind of company you're working in. So if you work for a company that owns the IP that you're making, then the concepts tend to be quite rough because there's no need to communicate it to the outside world until you're going to do a release. However, when you're a company, say, making something for somebody else and it's their IP, you do end up having to polish it, I would say, more than is necessary to get the job done, because it has to go to other people in other companies for them to see progress and see that it's coming along nicely. So unfortunately, I've had that chat a lot of times with the artists where they're like, well, this has already served its purpose. Why do I have to spend another 2 days making it beautiful? So because it's going to go and be seen by executives at, at Marvel or Warner Brothers or whoever. And so unfortunately, we need to, do the show, basically.
Another question.
Yeah, by all means.
For a junior artist, would you recommend putting those rough sketches on ArtStation then as part of your portfolio?
I think you can. Yes, but you need to probably explain what they are. So the thing is, wrongly, I think, people expect to see really polished work on the internet. But when you're actually being recruited by somebody who's a professional, they don't want to see the really rendered stuff. They want to see the ideas. So I think you need a bit of both. Like if you fill your ArtStation page with rough drawings and don't explain what they are, people think maybe this is as good as they get. Do you know what I mean? And that's your best work. So I think you almost, I used to always say like to the guys, like show me your top 3 best rendered images as well as all your sketches. And that would give me a good idea of what the range was, basically. So you need it all.
So you also mentioned, creating all these pieces of artwork that will go out to different streams. How much of that is a consideration to adapting things for like future Lego or future, like the Batman example there, that was probably created to drive toy sales. Like, is that really still a consideration at your design phase, or is that someone else's future problem?
It's someone else's future problem, but I tend to be thinking about it because I want my stuff to become Lego. You know, that's the coolest thing. You know what I mean? That's the best. So I'm not going to make something that couldn't work as Lego. You know, I will always be thinking. And also as an artist, you really should be, any design you do should be reducible down to the simplest forms. And if you can't reduce it to its simplest forms, it's not actually a very strong design. So really, any great design should work fine as a toy, because you should be able to reduce it down to that. But no, I'm not often thinking about that. The other thing as well is, I didn't cover it here, sometimes as an art director, you are actually a custodian on a journey of a product. So by that I mean Star Wars, right? It's been going for what, like 50 years now, is it? Yeah, 50 years. That must have had hundreds of art directors at some point touch that product at various points, but have to be respectful of what came before and respectful of what's going to come in the future. And those kind of jobs, I've done a few of them in my time. They're quite challenging, and I'm not sure I actually enjoy them as much as I do a blank canvas. So, for example, with the Marvel movies, the Thor 2 film that we did came off the back of Thor 1, which had already been done a few years before by a different team. So we had to be respectful to what they'd done, and we couldn't always do something really outlandish with it. Whereas Guardians of the Galaxy had never been done before, and we were the first people to touch it from when it was a comic book. And Marvel were like, the comics weren't successful, so just do what you want with it. You know, so it was having that open sort of briefed for it was fantastic.
Oh, hi. My name's Alex. Hi. I'm a producer with the studio Radical Forge. Kind of a question. You touched on the point with the Batman suits, that they kind of iterated to the point there were too many greebles. I remember growing up and like going through, I guess, what some people call the grimdark era, when you had like the Dark Knight Rises with Nolan, the kind of very technical Batman suit, and you saw that reflected in Halo 4 when that was around the same era. As a person that's worked through franchises like, say, Mortal Kombat and also movies, like, where do you think that comes from? Is it more from the creatives trying to iterate and pushing it in a new direction, or is it from like trying to reflect the current trends of the times and matching to it? Like, where's the balancing force as a person that would have made those decisions?
There's definitely a degree of trend following that I don't actually really like, but what tends to happen, just like fashion, right? Somebody wears something cool, it looks cool on them, and suddenly everyone's wearing it. And it's the same with, like we went for a period 10 years ago where all soldiers had like these faceless masks with two lights at the side, or like one red light, or whatever, and they all look like that. And it's because there will have been one product that was really successful, and everyone went, "Oh my God, that looks so cool," and then they just copy it. And it's a shame that it happens, but I think it's a natural part of human response to something that's cool, to imitate it,
Hi, I'm Aless. I'm a second-year game dev student, and I was going to ask for advice in regards to creative endeavors, going back to working in jobs that you may not enjoy. No, not just necessarily like advice like, do it for the money, because I understand that would be a main motivator, but generally about how to get into the process of working on things you may not enjoy or may not value or may not like.
I think that you have to find what you enjoy in everything that you do, right? Like, all right, there's things, scrubbing toilets. Yeah, you're not going to find the enjoyment in that, although you might really like a freshly cleaned bowl at the end. Some people do. But, take pride in that. But generally, if you're working as an artist, there's always going to be something you like doing. I worked, my first game I actually did like doing. But the second game I did a football game called UEFA Challenge. And I was like 21 at the time, not into football at all. And I ended up working on this game for 2 years. What I did enjoy was, I enjoyed the actual act of modeling the art. That was fine, regardless of what it was. I enjoyed trying to capture the likeness of a location in a 3D model. And I enjoyed actually also doing quite a lot of the user interface design work, and how, because I'd not really worked in graphic design, so that was quite interesting. But did I enjoy making those games? Not really, but every day I found something that was pleasing in it, and it was better than, like I say, working in a bank. when you get sort of later on in your career and more sort of, you can, call the shots a little bit more, that's when you can really start picking the products that you want to work on. But I think in the early days, it's good actually to also do some things that you don't necessarily like doing, because it always teaches you something. And it teaches you also later in life what you don't like doing. So it's a good thing.
Thank you.
Cheers. Anyone else? Question over here.
Hi, I'm Mai, and I'm a 3D environment artist in my final year of university. But I'm also really interested in like concept art and like that kind of development phase, because I really like painting and drawing as well. And I was just wondering kind of about what would you say like is transferable from that 3D knowledge of like doing that kind of pipeline and stuff to concept development? Because I know like doing 3D blockouts, for example, and painting over them is like quite a common thing in concept art, but like outside of that, like how else do those kind of feed into each other?
A lot does. So I also started out as a 3D modeler. And I didn't draw anything. It's bizarre because now I paint with oils and I'm really in there with, but that's not where I started out. And I think it depends also on like what kind of mind you have. Like a lot of people who are artists who go into 3D tend to be creative, but also quite technical. And that's also how I am with my approach now to oil painting, for example. I'm not like one of these artists who's just splashing stuff on everywhere. I'm quite considered in how I do it. So I think that's fine. You just, if you have a slightly more technical mind, it just means that when you translate that into concept, you're going to have a more technical outlook on that. Now, what I have found though, and this is sort of stereotyping, but it tends to be the case, 3D modelers who go into concept often end up being better at things like hard surface, vehicle design, or like environment concept, or like physical things, whereas the more sort of creative artists who maybe go straight into concept straight away tend to be the look and mood kind of people who come up with it. And like I say, it's not a hard and fast rule, but they just tend to gravitate that way. Right. And it also works as well if you're a 3D modeler, because then you can block out the shapes you want. For say you're going to do a ruined cityscape, you block all the buildings out in 3D, you get your camera right, and then you can pretty much paint it from there. So it works.
Yeah, that's good. Thank you.
Okay, time for one more question maybe.
Hi, I'm Sasha, a second-year game art student. I was wondering, how do you go about constructing your art bibles or art guides for your teams?
Yes, very good question. I would love to have covered that in this, but I don't have enough time. So basically, I think of the art bible as being a constantly living document. So when you start out, it's full of the sort of rangefinder guides of where the product is, where it fits in the with not a lot else other than reference and rangefinders to work out where we're going. And then as you start to design things, those designs go into the art bible along with the references, but also the things that don't work go in there. So those sheets I created where it is not reference sheet. Say you've got 10 failed concepts and 20 successful concepts, the failed ones go on the failed side and then with an explanation of why they failed. Because the good thing about that is then as new artists join the team, because teams tend to grow, right? It starts off with a handful of people, maybe even one person, and particularly with a big AAA video game, it suddenly grows to 50, 100 people, and each person who comes in is going, well, why did you do it that way? And then they try and cover ground that sometimes we've already covered. So by having those is and is not sort of sheets in there, you're able to say, oh, you already tried that, and I see why it failed, because you're explaining it here, so it's important. But yeah, it's a living document, and I mean, mine normally start off as like 10 pages. I've got one for a game that is like 150 pages long, because that game got really complicated. And then you get to a point where you're in production, and then it kind of goes on the shelf, to be honest, because in production, everyone's then making the content, and occasionally you're referring back to things, but you're not using it as much.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, well, I think that's about it. So big round of applause for Cumron and Ashtiani.